Hi, I'm Dave Boyt with the Potter Shop Hollow Tree Farm and Portable Sawmill, and yep, I got a brand new Norwood HD38 and I just got it put together and I can't wait to see how it cuts wood. Now, assembling the mill looks like a daunting task. That manual is over an inch thick, but it's full of pictures and breakaway diagrams, and if you follow it step by step, all of the parts fit together perfectly. Doesn't take any special tools or expertise on your part. I made a video putting this one together, so if you're thinking about building one or you're in the process, maybe it'll help you out a little bit. But I added my own touches to it. I did some of the steps a little bit out of sequence from what the manual calls for because that made more sense to me. And I added some thread lock in some places, anti-seize compound in others, lock washers, fender washers, that type of thing where I thought they should be, but that's just the way I learned to put things together. But the main thing is, if you just pay attention to the instructions and use a little common sense, it's not that hard. So, let's get started. First off, let's start with a list of tools. It's easiest to get them all together before you start. You need a Sharpie, tape measure, wire strippers, utility knife, combination wrenches, both SAE and metric, a 3/8 socket set with a 3-inch extension and a 9/16 inch deep socket, vice grips, a couple of 2 to 3 inch C-clamps, crescent wrench, a torque wrench that's good in the 12 to 15 foot-pound range, drill and drill bits, 12-volt battery charger, and I'd recommend a 1/2 inch NC thread tap. A few other things are a dozen 3/8 inch fender washers, a dozen 3/8 inch flat washers, blue thread lock, anti-seize compound, an assortment of zip ties, a number 10 nut and washer, and a 6mm by 14mm bolt. A piece of plywood across the track makes a convenient layout platform for starting the project. You can support the sawhead spacers with a couple of 2x4 strips with 2x8s set crossways on top of them. So that way is towards the front of the sawmill. This is the non-operator side, operator's side, and we've got these marked 8 inches apart. Set the sawhead spacers on the wood supports as shown. Okay, so it helps to have everything laid out, and I even marked the metal parts themselves and set those in place. The short plates go on the non-operator side, and you want the one with the square cutouts to be on top. That's what the tops of the carriage bolts will engage. So it mounts in like this. With the longer plates, and again, the plate with the square cutouts is going to go on the top. Your right or towards the front. Unless you have 3 hands, the easiest way to install the shims is to put the bolts in from underneath and hold them in place by setting them on the wood supports. Set the sawhead panel in place and bolt it down finger tight. Now turn the whole thing upside down. Set the guide blocks and the side guard brackets in place. The guard brackets are different, so make sure to put them on the right way. Now you're ready to assemble the carriage roller frames. On the non-operator side, the longest spacer goes on the outside of the roller like this. Flipping the frame end over end keeps everything oriented the same for installing the rollers and spacers on the other end of the frame. On the operator side, the roller goes between two spacers. The longer of the remaining spacers, part 102, goes to the inside, and the slightly shorter one, part 300, goes to the outside. Sawmill comes with a 3/8 inch NC tap. Some of the powder coat can get down in the threads, and you want to go ahead and clear the powder coat out of those threads before you put it on the mill. Just kind of feel your way around, get it square, nice and slow. If it snags, if it starts to grab on you, then immediately back out and try again. Because we're, again, not moving any metal, we're just getting the powder coat out. Let it find its way through. The set screws are stainless steel, and they can actually cold weld themselves to the mild steel inside threads. To avoid that, I put some anti-seize compound on all set screws before installing them. Now, that brush looks terrible, but it'll work. All we're going to do is just get some of that anti-seize compound on the bolt. Get it started by hand. I like to get the set screws started before putting parts on the mill. That way, when I drop one, I can find it again. Norwood doesn't provide extras. There, that's all you need. And of course, we'll do the same to the other side. The instructions call for tightening up these nuts now, and since it's a carriage bolt, all I have to do is push against the bottom to 15/16 inch. All you want to do is bring the nut flush to the housing. That nylon insert will keep it from backing out, and that bearing should turn freely. And of course, we'll catch the other side as well. So push it in, get that carriage bolt engaged. That's all you need. It's secure, roller spins freely, and we're good to go. Carefully set the rollers on the track, making sure they're facing in the right direction. And you want the groove of the roller underneath to catch that ridge of the track, so that it moves freely. Then bolt the track spacer guide on the roller frame to hold it in place. Everything needs to be square on the track. So the idea is to have a good steady base to set our platform on. I'm going to throw on a couple of clamps here. C-clamp. I'll throw a vice grips on the back side. Now we'll line up our holes. Looks pretty good. Looks good here. Everything's square. and ready to drop in our uprights. Make sure the vertical posts drop all the way down into the bracket. You'll hear them clunk, and you should see it through the cutout on the bottom. Our upper guide blocks. Upper guide block bracket. And our bolts. We're just going to put them in enough to engage the threads. There. Carefully tap through the 3 set screws on both top corner brackets to clear out the powder coating. And then put anti-seize compound on the set screws and thread them on. Then set them on the vertical posts. When installing the horizontal cross tube, the thin flange plates go between the tube and the top brackets, and the thicker plates go on the outside of the top brackets. Once that's done, remove the track spacer and install the rear leg assemblies. Finger tight for now. And we're just going to come in finger tight for now. The scale bracket goes on the operator's side. And the bracket for the swivel pulley bolts on the other side. Just finger tight for now. On the non-operator side, pretty much the same. We'll go ahead and put on our bolts and flange nuts. And the bracket for the swivel pulley. The manual recommends putting the bolts in from the back side of the rear horizontal cover panel and the nylon lock nuts toward the front. All right, it's time to tighten everything down. Just snug down the guide block to avoid stripping out the threads. And the bearing rides in the fixture under the track so that there's no way that the sawmill can lift up off the track and derail. So the best way to do this is to have the mill all the way to the front of the track, and we're going to take off one end stop. The other one stays in place because we don't want this thing rolling off the end of the mill. That bearing is not out far enough to engage the frame, so we're going to put a few washers behind it to bring it out just a little bit. And I like to have a washer on the outside of that, and then a nut, and it can slide up and down, and you can see it engages the way it should. But we don't want it to be binding, so I've got just a piece of cardboard, probably a 1/16, maybe even a little bit less than that, to space it down. And that looks about right. All right, now we're ready to replace our end stop. And do the other side. All right, now that we've got the front roller bearings in place where they need to be and tightened down, we'll just roll the carriage to the other end of the track and do the back end, same way. Felt pads just fit in the front of the track roller, and that just brushes off any sawdust and helps it go straight. We'll push it all the way down, and then we'll saturate it with oil. And I like to use chainsaw bar oil for just about everything. Has good staying power. And I'll come back and add some more later once that's soaked in. And of course we'll do the other side. Alright, so we'll put a liberal coat of grease on the shaft. And it says to grease the inside of the spacer cone as well. Probably the easiest way to do that is just slide it on and work it around a little. Notice also we have the taper end of that spacer cone towards the flange on the shaft, and that's important. Make sure you get that right. Slide that on, then slide on the flange bearing flush with the end of the winch shaft and tighten down the set screws. And the spacer cone goes against that flange bearing. We'll tighten down those set screws. All right, greasy gloppy mess. And we'll do the other end, pretty much the same. Again, the taper end of the spacer cone goes towards the flange on the shaft. And this time we're going to push it all the way up against the shaft, and the flange bearing also all the way against that cone. And we are just going to snug that down for now. We'll have to reposition the spacer cone and flange bearing once we get everything in place, but this way at least it won't come apart while we're assembling it. So that'll just hold it for now. Install the winch shaft with the keyed end on the operator's side. The mounting bolts should protrude inward. Now we'll loosen up that set screw that we snugged down on that flange bearing to hold it in place, and we can slide it against the housing and bolt it in place. Then tighten down the two flange bearing set screws on the operator side. Then we'll slide the spacer cone against the flange bearing and tighten it down. All right, we now have the winch shaft and spacer cones in place. And again, to be clear on both sides, that spacer cone has to be against the flange bearing. Assemble the two lower fixed pulleys. Just tighten the nuts to where they contact the pulley housings without bending them. Pulleys should turn freely. When attaching the pulleys to the sawhead platform, just tighten the nuts until they contact the mounting plate without bending it. Drop the yoke into the sawhead. Put on the flat washer and our nut. And we want to shoot for a 1/2 inch of thread under that nut. Then attach the two top pulleys. The pulleys on the other side go together exactly the same way. If the threaded rod is more than 1 inch long, cut it off to 1 inch. Attach the loop end of the cable to the yoke. Then thread it over the top fixed pulley, down through the lower fixed pulley, and finally over the swiveling pulley. Thread one nut all the way onto the threaded rod on the end of the cable. Feed it through, and then thread on the other nut. They're both metric, 10 millimeter. And we'll snug her down. Repeat the process on the other side of the mill. All right, we'll get a little grease on that shaft and work it in. And we'll line that keyway up with the motor. Slip the key in place. And slide on the motor. And bolt it to the frame. Bolt the push handle to the operator's side upright post at a convenient height. You can always change it later if you need to. There we go. That should just about work. Clean out the powder coating from the threads on the bottom of the operator side winch housing. Then install the water valve housing. And I'm going to slide it so that that valve just touches the housing right here. That's where I'll tighten it down. Bolt the water tank mounting bracket on, finger tight for now. You'll need to adjust it to line up with the tank. Screw on the cap. And insert the grommet on the bottom of the water tank. And just finger tight until we get all the bolts started. A little blue thread lock will help keep the water tank mounting bolts in place. And we'll get everything tightened down. And don't forget to tighten down the bracket. Finally, insert the spigot. A little soapy water will help slip it into the grommet. The emergency stop switch shuts down the engine. Start out by stripping about 6 inches of the outer gray insulation from the wires. Then strip about 1/4 inch of insulation from each wire and twist the ends of the wires. Slide a connector onto each wire and clamp down hard to secure it. If the wire feels the least bit loose, clamp down on the connector again so it doesn't come apart. Insert the stop switch into the hole on the cross plate and secure it with the nut on the back side. Then clip the wire connector onto it. And your stop cable runs down along the bottom and down through this hole right here. Put the sticker above or below the switch so you can find it easily. I added a zip tie to make sure it stays in place. Before installing the winch covers, clean out the inside thread. There are 2 threaded nuts on the bottom and 2 on the side. Yeah, there's a little powder coat there. Good thing we did it. Bolt the winch covers in place. And we'll tighten them down. The easiest way to attach the blade guide roller to the shaft is to hold the shaft in a vise while you thread on the nylon insert nut. I added a washer between the roller bearing and the nut. Doesn't need to be super tight. Main thing is there's no play back and forth, and it spins freely on those bearings. Operator side trunnion block. Here's what you need to put it together. These parts slip together, shoulder bolt, and I highly recommend blue thread lock here so it doesn't come loose. Slip in our collar bolt. And you want it just snug enough that it can pivot freely. We'll give it a little more here, see what happens. Okay, see, that's too tight. Back off just a hair. That's what we want right there. Then we'll put on our blade angle adjusting bolts. You want to set them up so that these 2 lines are parallel, that groove is parallel, and that should get us pretty close to level on our blade guide. We will have to adjust it, but this will make it a little easier. There we go. So the ceramic guide goes in this way. And you put in our bolt. Yeah, I like to put a washer behind that bolt just to distribute the pressure a little. And just lightly snug that down. There we go. Now we can insert the ceramic guide. And the lock bolt. So we want the top of the guide even with the surface of the mount for now. And we'll snug that down just enough that that guide doesn't fall out on us. There we go. And finally, the bearing guide slides in. And on this one, I recommend that the bolt that holds the guide in place goes on this side. Just a little easier to get to when you're adjusting it. And we are just going to snug it down just enough that that guide doesn't try to come out on us. There we go. And there's our operator side trunnion block. Non-operator side trunnion block. Attach the linear blade guide bracket to the track with socket cap screws. Give the linear guide a shot of grease, but be careful not to apply too much, or you can force the grease fitting out of the threads. The fifth bolt on the track is a carriage bolt and a washer. They serve as a stop to keep the guide from coming off the end of the track. When you install the sliding rack onto the adjustable blade guide assembly, just snug the nut and bolt up to the assembly without bending the sides. The rack needs to pivot freely. The two socket head screws that go directly over the track need to be flush with or below the top of the surface of the bracket. Use the low profile head screws for these. Installing the handle is a bit tricky, but if you hold the shaft with an Allen wrench while you turn the nut, it goes pretty easy. We'll grease our tracking bolt, thread it in place. And just get some grease on both sides. Make a goopy gloppy mess here. And of course get the other side. Then you've got this vertical plate right here, and we'll grease both sides of it. Now our blade tension adjusting plate is ready to slide in place. Remove the end cap and slide our well-lubricated blade adjustment plate in place. We got the two reinforcing plates. One goes on top, the other directly below that. Carriage bolt. And hold that in place while you put on the nylon insert nut. We'll put in these two shoulder bolts next. Third shoulder bolt needs to be greased because it's going to have to slide. Then we'll put a nut on it. Tighten them all down except for the shoulder bolt and the slotted hole. You'll need to take it back out when you install the axle. And the whole thing ought to just slide easily. And we'll drop in the U-bracket and secure it with the cotter pin. Now you can put the end cap back on and tighten the bolts. Next we got some spacers to slide on. Tensioning spring, a flat washer. I'm going to slide the tensioning assembly back to expose those threads, and we'll get a little grease on them. Then a little grease to the inside threads of the T-handle. Then give the handle a few turns onto the tensioner bolt. And the blade tensioning assembly should slide in and out freely. And for now, I'm just going to take that T-handle off so it doesn't stick out and I walk into it. And we'll grease up the axle for the non-operator side. While we're at it, we'll go ahead and put a little grease on the bolt that adjusts the tracking and on that shoulder bolt. Now you can put the end cap back on and tighten the bolts. When bolting on the non-operator side blade guide vertical adjustment plate, and that's a long name for such a small part, push the bolts in up from the bottom. That'll give you more room to attach the blade guide assembly later. But hold off installing the blade guides for now. You may see them in the video, but it will be easier to install them after you've mounted the blade and set the band wheel tracking. The blade guide sliding latch goes on the operator's side of the mill. To attach the sliding guide bracket, remove the two carriage bolts and replace them with 3-inch flange bolts. And tighten them down. The adjustable bracket should slide freely when the handle is lifted. And lock in place when the handle is down. And that takes care of the carriage and sawhead assembly. In the next video, I'll install the engine and finish building the sawmill.